The fire alarm was screaming through the hotel corridors as I ran toward the exit, but the security guard blocking my path had burns covering half his face and kept shouting that I needed to stay at my post until the guests were evacuated. The problem was that the hotel had been empty for renovations for 6 months, and this guard had died in the same spot 37 years ago during the last fire that swept through this building, but led me back up to 3 months ago when I was just Tyler Brooks, 26-year-old college dropout with a security license and exactly zero prospects for anything better than minimum wage work. The overnight security position at the Grandview Hotel seemed like a blessing after 2 months of unemployment and a dwindling bank account that was making me seriously consider moving back in with my parents. The Grandview was a historic downtown hotel that had been closed to guests since January while undergoing a complete renovation. Built in 1924, it had been the crown jewel of the city's hospitality industry for decades before falling into disrepair during the economic downturn. A development company had purchased the building and was converting it into luxury condos, but they needed security during the construction phase. The job interview was conducted by Patricia Hendricks, the project manager overseeing the renovation. She met me in the lobby, which was currently a maze of scaffolding, plastic sheeting, and construction equipment. The original marble floors and ornate ceiling were still visible beneath the renovation chaos, giving glimpses of what the hotel had once been. "The position is pretty straightforward," Patricia explained as we walked through the gutted space. "Overnight security, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Monday through Friday. Your main job is to make sure nobody breaks in and steals construction equipment or vandalizes the work that's been completed." She handed me a clipboard with building layouts and security protocols. "The construction crews work during normal business hours, so the building should be completely empty during your shifts. You'll do hourly rounds, check that all entrances are secure, and document anything unusual in the security log." The pay was decent for what seemed like easy work. Sit in a temporary security office, walk through an empty building a few times each night, and get paid to essentially babysit a construction site. After weeks of job rejections, it felt almost too good to be true. "Any questions about the building layout or security procedures?" Patricia asked as we completed our tour. "What about the building's history? Any previous security issues I should know about?" Patricia's expression tightened slightly. "The Grandview has been a hotel for almost a century. Like any old building, it has stories, but nothing that should affect your security duties. The important thing is to focus on current concerns, unauthorized access, theft, that kind of thing." I signed the employment paperwork that afternoon and started the following Monday. My first week was exactly as advertised: quiet, routine, and slightly boring. The building was a maze of construction zones and plastic barriers, but I quickly learned the layout and established a comfortable patrol route. The security office was set up in what had once been the hotel's business center, complete with a desk, chair, and a bank of monitors showing feeds from cameras positioned at all the major entrances. During my rounds, I'd walk through each floor, checking that doors were locked and looking for any signs of unauthorized entry. The Grandview was beautiful, even in its current state of renovation. The lobby retained its original marble columns and crystal chandeliers. The guest floors had been stripped down to bare walls and flooring, but you could still see the craftsmanship in the crown molding and window frames. It was the kind of place where wealthy travelers had once stayed, and you could almost imagine the ghosts of elegant parties and important business meetings. By my second week, I developed a comfortable routine. First round at midnight, second round at 2 a.m., third round at 4 a.m., final round at 6 a.m., before the construction crews arrived. Between rounds, I'd sit in the security office, monitor the camera feeds, and work on online courses that might eventually help me find better employment. That's when I started noticing inconsistencies in the camera footage. It began with small things: shadows that moved when there was no one there to cast them, lights that flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, construction equipment that appeared to have been moved slightly between my hourly checks, even though the building was supposedly empty. I mentioned these observations to Patricia during my first weekly check-in. "Probably just the building settling," she said without much interest. "Old buildings make noise, and construction work can affect electrical systems. As long as there's no evidence of break-ins or theft, these kinds of minor irregularities aren't really concerning." But the irregularities became more frequent and more obvious. I'd see movement in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned to look directly. I'd hear footsteps above me when I was on the top floor. Most unsettling of all, I began finding doors that I'd locked during previous rounds, standing open for no apparent reason. During my third week, I encountered something that couldn't be explained away as building, settling, or electrical problems. I was making my 2 a.m. rounds when I heard what sounded like a radio playing somewhere on the 4th floor. Old music. The kind of big band jazz that might have been popular when the hotel first opened. Following the sound, I traced it to room 412, which was supposed to be completely empty. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see light coming from inside. When I pushed the door open, I found myself looking at something that made no sense. The room was fully furnished in period-appropriate 1920s decor. Dark wood furniture, thick carpeting, heavy curtains drawn across the windows. A radio on the nightstand was playing Glenn Miller, and there was a suitcase on the bed like someone had just checked in. The air smelled like cigarettes and expensive cologne, scents that had no business being in a construction zone. I backed out of the room immediately and radioed Patricia, even though it was the middle of the night. When she didn't answer, I called her cell phone directly. "Tyler, what's wrong? Is everything okay?" I found a fully furnished room on the 4th floor, room 412. It looks like someone's been living here, or like the renovation crew missed it completely. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Tyler, there are no furnished rooms in the building. Everything was cleared out months ago. Then you need to see this. There's furniture, a radio playing. It even smells occupied." Patricia sighed. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't touch anything until I arrive." While I waited for Patricia, I stood in the hallway outside room 412, watching the light under the door and listening to the music that was still playing inside. But when Patricia arrived and we opened the door together, the room was empty. Bare walls, concrete floor, construction debris scattered around. No furniture, no radio, no sign that anything unusual had been there. "Tyler," Patricia said, studying my face with concern. "How much sleep have you been getting? Night shift work can be disorienting, especially in an environment like this." I stared at the empty room, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced with what we were both seeing now. I know what I saw. There was furniture, music. The whole room was different. Old buildings can play tricks on your perception, especially when you're tired and working alone. Why don't you take tomorrow night off? Get some rest, and we'll see how you feel. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? The evidence of what I'd experienced had simply vanished. Either I was losing my mind, or something impossible had happened in room 412. I took Patricia's advice and spent the next night at home, trying to convince myself that fatigue and isolation had created a hallucination. But when I returned to work 2 nights later, I was more alert and more determined to document anything unusual. That's when I started seeing him. It began as glimpses in my peripheral vision during rounds. A figure in a dark uniform moving through the hallways just ahead of me. At first, I assumed it was another security guard. Maybe someone Patricia had hired for additional coverage without telling me. But when I tried to catch up and introduce myself, the figure would disappear around corners or through doors that led to empty rooms. By my 4th week, the encounters became more direct. I'd be sitting in the security office when I'd catch sight of someone walking past the window. When I checked the camera feeds, there would be no one there. But the monitors would sometimes show movement in areas I'd just confirmed were empty. The breakthrough came when I started comparing my observations with the building's history. I spent my breaks researching the Grandview Hotel, learning about its decades of operation and the various events that had taken place within its walls. That's when I found the newspaper article about the fire. Hotel security guard dies in blaze. The headline was from October 15th, 1987. The article described a fire that had started in the hotel's kitchen and spread through several floors before being contained. Most guests and staff had been evacuated safely, but one person had died in the incident. Frank Kowalski, 34, a night security guard who had worked at the Grandview for 6 years, was found dead on the 4th floor. According to witnesses, Kowalski had been helping guests evacuate when he was overcome by smoke. His body was discovered near the main stairwell, apparently having collapsed while trying to reach safety. The article included a photograph of Frank Kowalski in his security uniform. Dark hair, serious expression, probably in his early 30s when the photo was taken. He looked exactly like the figure I'd been seeing during my rounds. I printed the article and stared at the photograph for a long time. The face was unmistakably the same as the man I'd encountered in the hallways, though the figure I'd been seeing had burns covering the left side of his face and neck. The next night, I came to work prepared. I brought a digital camera, a voice recorder, and a notebook to document everything I experienced. If I was being haunted by the ghost of Frank Kowalski, I wanted evidence. I didn't have to wait long. During my midnight round, I encountered him on the 4th floor, near the spot where his body had been found. He was standing in the hallway, facing the main stairwell, wearing a security uniform identical to mine except for the extensive burn damage visible on the left side of his body. "Frank?" I called out softly. He turned toward me, and for the first time, I got a clear look at his face. The right side was normal, exactly matching the newspaper photograph. The left side was a mass of scar tissue and burns, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice that sounded like smoke. "Building's not safe during a fire." I looked around the hallway. There was no fire, no smoke, no sign of any emergency. "Frank, there's no fire. It's 2024. The fire was 37 years ago." He looked confused for a moment, then shook his head. "Got to get the guests out. That's the job. Can't leave until everyone's safe." That's when I understood what was happening. Frank Kowalski had died trying to evacuate hotel guests during the 1987 fire. His spirit was trapped in that moment, still trying to complete the job that had killed him. Night after night, he was reliving his final shift, searching for guests who were no longer there. "Frank," I said gently, "there are no guests. The hotel is closed. Everyone got out safely." "Oh," his burned face twisted with anguish. "No, there are still people on the upper floors. I can hear them calling for help. Have to get them out before the fire spreads." He turned and started walking toward the stairwell, moving with the determined pace of someone with urgent work to complete. I followed him, trying to think of some way to help him understand that his vigil was no longer necessary. Over the following weeks, I had regular conversations with Frank during my rounds. He was always polite, always professional, but completely convinced that he was still working the night shift during the 1987 fire. He'd patrol the hallways, check doors, and search empty rooms for guests who existed only in his memory. Sometimes he'd ask me about evacuation procedures or warn me about areas where the fire was supposedly spreading. Other times he'd share details about his work, talking about guests he'd helped and problems he'd solved during his 6 years of employment. "Been working here since '81, he told me one night as we walked through the empty lobby. "Good job, decent pay, and I like helping people. Hotel security isn't just about catching thieves. Sometimes guests lock themselves out of their rooms, or they need directions, or they're scared because they're traveling alone. Being here at night, it's like being the guardian of people's safe space. I began to understand why Frank's spirit couldn't move on. He dedicated himself to protecting people, and he died trying to fulfill that responsibility. His sense of duty was so strong that death itself couldn't release him from his obligations. But my attempts to help Frank find peace were complicated by Patricia's growing concern about my mental health. During our weekly check-ins, she'd ask increasingly pointed questions about my sleep patterns, stress levels, and observations during my shifts. "Tyler, I've been reviewing your security reports," she said during my 6th week of employment. "You've been documenting a lot of unusual incidents. Doors opening, lights flickering, sounds that don't have obvious sources. Are you feeling overwhelmed by the isolation of night shift work?" I wanted to tell her about Frank, but I knew how that conversation would go. Either she'd think I was having a breakdown, or she'd find some way to explain away what I'd experienced. Instead, I tried to minimize my recent reports, just trying to be thorough in my documentation. Better to report too much than miss something important. Patricia nodded, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. "Maybe we should consider rotating you to day shifts once the renovation is complete. Night work isn't for everyone." The situation came to a crisis during my 7th week, when Frank's behavior began to change. Instead of his usual professional demeanor, he started showing signs of distress and confusion that suggested his spiritual condition was deteriorating. I'd find him standing in hallways, looking lost and disoriented. He'd repeat conversations we'd already had, sometimes asking the same questions multiple times during a single encounter. Most concerning of all, he began insisting that I was one of the guests who needed to be evacuated. "Sir, you need to come with me," he'd say, approaching me with urgent intensity. "The fire's spreading faster than we expected. I have to get you to safety." When I tried to explain that I was a security guard like him, he'd become agitated and confused. "No, you're in room 237. You called the front desk about smoke in the hallway. I'm here to help you evacuate." The final confrontation happened on a Friday night during my 8th week of employment. I was making my 4 a.m. round when I encountered Frank near the main stairwell, exactly where his body had been found 37 years earlier. But this time, everything was different. The hallway was filled with smoke. Not visible smoke, but I could smell it, acrid and choking, carrying the scent of burning wood and melting plastic. Emergency lighting had replaced the normal illumination, casting everything in a hellish red glow. And for the first time since I'd started working at the Grandview, I could hear other voices. Guests calling for help from upper floors, staff members shouting evacuation instructions, the sound of fire alarms and emergency vehicles approaching the building. It was like being transported back to October 15th, 1987, experiencing the night Frank Kowalski had died. "There you are," Frank said when he saw me, relief evident in his voice. "Been looking for you. We need to get you out of here right now. The fire's out of control." I looked around the hallway, seeing it as Frank was experiencing it. Smoke-filled corridors, emergency lighting, the sounds of a building in crisis. But I also knew that none of it was real in 2024. This was Frank's death playing out again, and somehow, I'd been pulled into his spiritual replay of that terrible night. "Frank," I said, "we need to talk. This fire happened 37 years ago. You died trying to save people. You don't have to keep doing this." His burned face contorted with anguish. "Can't leave. Still people trapped on the upper floors. That's my job, to make sure everyone gets out safe." "Everyone did get out safe, Frank. You made sure of that. You died a hero, but your job is finished. You can rest now." But Frank wasn't listening. He was staring past me toward the main exit, his expression changing to one of horror. "The exit's blocked," he whispered. "Fire spread to the stairwell. We're trapped." That's when I realized what was happening. Frank wasn't just reliving the night of the fire. He was reliving the moment of his death, the instant when he realized he wouldn't be able to save everyone, including himself, and in his spiritual confusion, he'd identified me as one of the people he'd failed to rescue. The smoke in the hallway was getting thicker, and I was beginning to have trouble breathing. Whether it was psychosomatic response to Frank's supernatural influence or something more direct, I was being pulled into his death experience. "Frank!" I shouted over the sound of fire alarms that were getting louder and more urgent. "You have to let go. The people you were trying to save, they all got out. You succeeded." He looked at me with eyes full of smoke and desperation. "But you're still here. You're still in danger. I can't leave you." That's when I understood. Frank had been waiting 37 years for someone to acknowledge his sacrifice, to confirm that his death had meaning. He'd been trapped in an endless loop of that final night, never able to complete his mission because he couldn't save everyone, including himself. I pulled out my phone and showed him the newspaper article I'd printed, the one that described his heroic death and confirmed that all hotel guests had been safely evacuated. "Look, Frank, this is proof. Everyone got out because of you. You saved them all." Frank stared at the article, reading his own obituary with growing understanding. The smoke in the hallway began to dissipate, and the emergency lighting faded back to normal illumination. "I died," he said quietly. "I died trying to get people out. You died a hero," I confirmed. "And everyone lived because of your sacrifice. Your job is finished, Frank. You can rest now." For the first time since I'd known him, Frank smiled. The burns on his face began to fade, replaced by the appearance he'd had in life. His uniform became clean and new, and the desperate urgency that had driven him for 37 years finally left his eyes. "Thank you," he said, "for helping me remember, for helping me understand that I did my job." He began to fade, becoming translucent as the spiritual energy that had kept him bound to the hotel finally dissipated. "Will you be okay?" he asked as he continued to fade. "Working here alone? I'll be fine, Frank. The building is safe now. You made sure of that." He nodded and smiled one last time before disappearing completely, leaving me alone in a hallway that suddenly felt peaceful for the first time since I'd started working at the Grandview. I finished my shift without any further supernatural encounters. The building felt different, lighter somehow, like a weight that had been pressing down on it for decades had finally been lifted. When Patricia arrived the next morning for our weekly check-in, she immediately noticed the change. "You look better," she said, studying my face with surprise. "More rested. Are you feeling better about the job?" "Much better," I said. "I think I've finally gotten used to working alone at night." What I didn't tell her was that I hadn't been working alone. For 8 weeks, I'd shared the building with the ghost of a security guard who died trying to protect people. And now that his spirit had found peace, the Grandview Hotel felt like just a building again, instead of a monument to unfinished business. The construction crews completed their renovation work 3 months later, and the building reopened as luxury condominiums. I kept working security until the last resident moved in, and I never encountered Frank Kowalski again. But sometimes, during my final rounds, I'd pause at the spot where he used to stand and remember the dedication that had kept him working 37 years past his death. Some people spend their whole lives looking for work that gives them purpose, that makes them feel like they're making a difference. Frank Kowalski found that work in hotel security, and he took it so seriously that even death couldn't make him abandon his post. I moved on to a different security job after the Grandview project ended, but I never forgot the lesson Frank taught me about dedication and sacrifice. Every time I put on my uniform and start my shift, I remember that security work isn't just about watching empty buildings or preventing theft. Sometimes it's about being the guardian of other people's peace of mind, and sometimes, if you're really lucky, you get the chance to help a fellow guard finish the job that's been keeping him awake for decades. Frank Kowalski spent 6 years protecting hotel guests, and 37 more years making sure his final shift was completed properly. He was the best security guard I ever met, even though he'd been dead since before I was born. If you've ever worked a job where you were alone at night in a big, empty building, you probably know that feeling of being watched, of hearing footsteps when no one else is supposed to be there. Next time that happens, remember that not all ghosts are malevolent. Some of them are just dedicated employees who haven't figured out that their shift ended a long time ago. And if you ever find yourself working security at a historic building with a tragic past, pay attention to the stories. Learn about the people who worked there before you, especially the ones who died on the job. Because sometimes the best way to help a restless spirit find peace is simply to acknowledge their sacrifice and confirm that their work mattered. Frank Kowalski died doing his job, and he kept doing it for 37 years after death because no one had ever told him that he'd succeeded. All he needed was someone to read him his own obituary and confirm that everyone had gotten out safely. Some hauntings aren't about revenge or unfinished business in the dramatic sense. Sometimes they're just about a dedicated worker who needs to know that they did their job well, even if it killed them. Sweet dreams. And remember to thank the security guards who keep you safe while you sleep. Some of them have been at it longer than you might imagine. The dining room chairs were scraping across the hardwood floor by themselves, arranging into a perfect circle around the table where 5 place settings had appeared, complete with steaming food that smelled like it had been rotting for decades. My wife was already sitting in one of the chairs, her eyes rolled back white, and I could see the ghostly figures of the Patterson family gesturing for me to take the empty seat that had been waiting for me all along. But let me back up to 6 weeks ago when Sarah and I were just another young couple house hunting in a market where everything decent was priced well beyond our means. I'm Marcus Wheeler, 31 years old, working as a project manager for a mid-sized construction company. Sarah's a nurse at the Children's Hospital. Combined, we make decent money, but not decent enough to afford the kind of house we wanted in any neighborhood we'd actually want to live in. We'd been looking for 8 months, getting outbid on every property that checked our boxes. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, decent neighborhood, under $300,000. In our city, that combination was apparently mythical. Our real estate agent, Jennifer Walsh, had shown us dozens of houses that were either too expensive, too small, or located in areas where we'd need security systems and prayer to feel safe. That's when Jennifer called us about the Patterson house. "I've got something unusual," she said during our weekly check-in call. Victorian house in Riverside Heights, 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, fully renovated kitchen, original hardwood floors throughout, listed at $220. Sarah and I looked at each other with the skeptical expressions of people who'd heard too many too-good-to-be-true pitches over the past 8 months. Riverside Heights was exactly where we wanted to live, and houses there typically started at $400,000. "What's the catch?" I asked. Jennifer hesitated. "The house comes fully furnished. Previous owners left everything behind when they moved. It's not exactly a catch, more like a bonus. Beautiful antique furniture, artwork, even dishes and linens. Everything you'd need to move right in." That still didn't explain the price. Houses in Riverside Heights that were fully furnished with antiques should have been listed at twice what Jennifer was quoting. "Why did the previous owners leave everything?" Sarah asked. "Family emergency," Jennifer said quickly. "They had to relocate out of state very suddenly for work. Couldn't take the furniture. Decided to sell everything together as a package deal. We scheduled a viewing for that Saturday morning. The Patterson house was a stunning example of late Victorian architecture, built in 1898 according to the listing. 3 stories of gingerbread trim, bay windows, and wraparound porch that looked like something from a fairy tale. The kind of house we dreamed about but never expected to afford. Jennifer met us at the front door with keys and a tablet full of property information. "Fair warning," she said as we walked up the front steps. "The furniture is distinctive, very period appropriate, but it might not be everyone's taste." She wasn't exaggerating. The house was furnished like a museum display of late 19th century domestic life. Heavy wooden furniture, elaborate wallpaper, thick carpets in rich colors that had probably been expensive when they were new. The living room featured a massive grandfather clock, shelves full of leather-bound books, and oil paintings of stern-faced people in formal Victorian dress. But it was beautiful in its own way, and everything appeared to be in excellent condition. The kitchen had been updated with modern appliances that were designed to blend with the vintage aesthetic. The bathrooms featured original clawfoot tubs alongside contemporary fixtures. Someone had spent serious money preserving the historical character while adding modern conveniences. "The dining room is really spectacular," Jennifer said, leading us through a set of pocket doors into a formal dining space that took my breath away. The room was dominated by a massive mahogany table surrounded by 8 matching chairs upholstered in deep red velvet. A crystal chandelier hung from an elaborately plastered ceiling, and the walls were lined with a china cabinet that displayed what looked like a complete set of fine porcelain. Oil paintings of pastoral scenes hung in heavy gold frames, and thick curtains framed tall windows that looked out onto the backyard garden. "This furniture has to be worth more than the asking price for the entire house," Sarah whispered to me as Jennifer showed us the built-in buffet and explaining the history of the dining set. "The table and chairs are original to the house," Jennifer said, "crafted by local artisans in 1898. The china is Haviland Limoges, probably worth a small fortune to collectors. The previous owners were very proud of this room." We spent 2 hours touring the house, and by the end of the visit, we were both convinced that we'd stumbled onto the deal of a lifetime. 3 floors of period-appropriate furnishings, a completely renovated kitchen, and a price that was almost too good to believe. "We want to make an offer," I told Jennifer as we stood in the front hallway preparing to leave. "Full asking price," Sarah added. "We don't want to risk losing this to another buyer." Jennifer smiled, but I caught something odd in her expression. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction that went beyond a typical real estate commission. "I'll draw up the paperwork this afternoon," she said. "The sellers are motivated, so we should be able to close quickly." The closing process moved faster than any real estate transaction I'd ever heard of. No inspection issues, no financing problems, no last-minute negotiations. Within 3 weeks, we owned a fully furnished Victorian house in the best neighborhood in the city for less than we'd budgeted for a fixer-upper in the suburbs. Moving day was surreal. Instead of the usual chaos of packing trucks and coordinating furniture delivery, we just loaded our clothes, personal items, and a few modern electronics into our cars and drove to our new house. Everything else we needed was already there, waiting for us. "I can't believe this is really ours," Sarah said as we carried our suitcases up to the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. The bedroom was furnished with a massive 4-poster bed, matching dresser and wardrobe, and a vanity table that looked like something a Victorian lady would use for her morning routine. Heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light, giving the room a formal, almost somber atmosphere. "It's going to take some getting used to," I admitted, looking around at furniture that was probably older than our grandparents. "But it's beautiful." Like living in a historical house museum, we spent our first week in the house slowly adapting to our new surroundings. The furniture was comfortable, despite its age, and everything functioned perfectly. The kitchen appliances were high-end models. The plumbing worked flawlessly, and even the antique light fixtures had been rewired for modern electrical standards. But there were small things that seemed off from the beginning. The dining room chairs would sometimes be slightly out of position when we came downstairs in the morning, pulled away from the table like someone had been sitting in them during the night. The first few times it happened, I assumed it was just the house settling or the chairs shifting on the hardwood floors. Then I started finding place settings on the table. It began with just one setting: a single plate, fork, knife, and spoon, arranged precisely at the head of the table when I came down for breakfast. Sarah assumed I'd left it there after dinner the previous night, and I assumed she'd set it out for some reason, but neither of us remembered placing it there. By our second week, the place settings increased to 2. By the third week, 3 complete place settings would appear overnight, always arranged with the same precise formality you'd see at an upscale restaurant. "This is getting weird," Sarah said one morning as we stood in the dining room looking at 4 place settings that had definitely not been there when we went to bed. "Maybe the house cleaner is doing it?" I suggested, though we hadn't hired a house cleaner yet. Sarah shook her head. "I think someone's been coming into the house at night. We need to change the locks and maybe install a security system." We had new locks installed that weekend and set up a wireless security system with cameras covering all the entrances. But the mysterious place settings continued to appear, and the cameras never showed anyone entering or leaving the house during the night. The breakthrough came during our 4th week when I decided to stay awake and watch the dining room directly. I set up a chair in the living room where I could see through the pocket doors and waited to see what would happen around midnight. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The dining room remained dark and empty, exactly as we'd left it after dinner. But around 1 a.m., I began to notice changes. The temperature in the house dropped noticeably, enough that I could see my breath in the dim light from the street lamps outside. The grandfather clock in the living room began chiming the hours more frequently, as if time itself was becoming unstable. Then I saw the first figure. She appeared gradually, like a photograph developing in a dark room. An elderly woman in a dark Victorian dress, moving around the dining room table with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the same tasks thousands of times. She was setting the table for what appeared to be a formal dinner party, placing each piece of china and silverware with meticulous care. As I watched, frozen in my chair, more figures began to materialize. A middle-aged man in a formal suit, adjusting the chairs and straightening the tablecloth. 2 younger women, possibly daughters, arranging flowers and lighting candles that had appeared from nowhere. A boy who couldn't have been more than 12, polishing water glasses until they gleamed in the candlelight. The Patterson family. They had to be. The previous owners who'd left everything behind weren't previous owners at all. They were the original owners, the people who'd lived in this house over a century ago. And they were still here, still preparing for dinner parties that would never end. I tried to move, to back away quietly and retreat upstairs to wake Sarah, but my body wouldn't respond to my commands. I could only sit there and watch as the ghostly family completed their preparations with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of decades of routine. The elderly woman, who seemed to be the matriarch of the family, paused in her work and looked directly at me. For a moment, our eyes met across the dim space between the living room and dining room, and I saw something in her expression that was both welcoming and terrifying. She smiled and gestured toward the table, which now held a complete feast. Roasted meat, elaborate side dishes, bottles of wine, and an ornate cake that looked like it belonged at a wedding celebration. 5 place settings, exactly as I'd been finding them each morning. But now I could see that one of them was meant for me. The other family members had noticed me as well. They were all looking in my direction with expressions of polite expectation, like hosts waiting for a tardy guest to join a dinner party that had already been delayed too long. That's when I managed to break free from whatever supernatural force had been holding me in place. I bolted upright from my chair and ran toward the staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time as I rushed to wake Sarah. "Sarah!" I shook her shoulder urgently. "You have to see this. There are people downstairs, in the dining room. The whole family. They're setting the table." Sarah sat up groggily, looking at me with confusion and concern. "What are you talking about?" "What people?" "The Patterson family. The previous owners. Except they're not previous owners. They're ghosts. They've been living here the whole time, and they want us to join them for dinner." Sarah followed me back downstairs, but when we reached the living room, the dining room was empty. No figures, no elaborate meal, no candles or flowers, just the same furniture we'd been living with for a month. arranged exactly as it always was, but there were 5 place settings on the table. Sarah stared at the precisely arranged dishes and silverware, then looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion or concern, but a kind of dreamy acceptance that made my blood run cold. "They've been waiting for us," she said softly. "Look how beautiful everything is. They've prepared such a lovely dinner." "Sarah, what are you talking about? There's no food, just empty plates." But even as I said it, I could smell something cooking. Rich, savory aromas that seemed to be coming from the dining room, despite the fact that I could clearly see the table held nothing but empty dishes. Sarah walked toward the dining room with the slow, measured pace of someone being drawn by an irresistible force. When she reached the table, she pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, her hands folded in her lap like a well-mannered dinner guest waiting for the meal to be served. "Sarah," I called, but she didn't respond. Her eyes had taken on a glassy, unfocused quality, and when I moved closer, I could see that she was looking at something I couldn't see. Her lips were moving slightly, like she was engaged in polite conversation with invisible dinner companions. That's when the other figures began to reappear. The Patterson family materialized around the table, taking their places in the remaining chairs with satisfied expressions. The elderly woman smiled at Sarah with obvious approval, and the other family members nodded their welcome to our newest dinner guest. I tried to grab Sarah's arm, to pull her away from the table, but my hand passed through her like she was made of mist. Whatever supernatural force was affecting her had made her partially incorporeal, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. "Sarah, you have to fight this," I pleaded. "They're trying to trap you here. Don't let them pull you into whatever happened to them." But Sarah was no longer responding to my voice. She was fully engaged in conversation with the ghost family, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear and participating in discussions about topics that existed only in their spectral reality. The elderly woman looked at me again, and this time her smile carried a note of impatience. She gestured toward the remaining empty chair, the one that had been set for me since this supernatural dinner party began. I realized that this was what had been happening all along. The Patterson family had been preparing for this moment, slowly drawing us into their eternal dinner party. The mysterious place settings hadn't been random supernatural activity. They'd been invitations, growing more insistent each night until we finally accepted. Looking at Sarah, who was now lifting an empty fork to her mouth like she was eating a delicious meal, I understood that I had 2 choices. I could run from the house, abandon my wife to whatever fate the Patterson family had planned for her, and spend the rest of my life wondering what had happened to the woman I loved. Or I could take my place at the table and join them for a dinner that would never end. The decision was easier than it should have been. I loved Sarah more than I feared death, and if she was trapped in this supernatural dinner party, then I would be trapped with her. I walked to the empty chair and sat down. The moment I took my place at the table, the dining room transformed around me. The empty plates filled with elaborate Victorian dishes, roasted fowl, rich gravies, exotic vegetables, and fine wines that sparkled in crystal glasses. The room itself became warmer and more welcoming, lit by dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows on the wallpapered walls. The Patterson family welcomed me with genuine warmth. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Patterson, explained that they had been waiting decades for the right family to join them, young couples who would appreciate the house's history and understand the importance of maintaining proper dinner traditions. "We died here in 1952, Margaret explained as we began our meal. Food poisoning from contaminated oysters during a celebration dinner. It was our anniversary, 25 years of marriage, and we'd invited our children home for a special meal. Her husband, William Patterson, nodded solemnly. We never got to finish that celebration. Died one by one over the course of 3 days, too sick to get proper medical attention. But the house preserved our spirits, kept our family together even after death. Their daughter, Elizabeth, who appeared to be in her 20s despite having died 70 years ago, smiled as she passed me a bowl of what looked like the most delicious soup I'd ever seen. We've been hosting dinner parties ever since, trying to recapture that feeling of family celebration that was taken from us. The younger daughter, Mary, who couldn't have been more than 18 when she died, giggled as she poured wine into my glass. We've had many guests over the years, but most of them weren't suitable for permanent residency. They didn't understand the importance of proper table manners. The son, Thomas, still a boy despite 7 decades of spectral existence, leaned toward me conspiratorially. Some of them tried to leave during the main course. Very rude behavior. Mother doesn't tolerate rudeness at her dinner table. I looked around the table at the Patterson family, understanding now why the house had been sold so cheaply and why it came fully furnished. This wasn't the first young couple to be drawn into their eternal dinner party. The previous owners Jennifer had mentioned, the ones who'd supposedly left due to a family emergency, had probably become part of the Patterson family's supernatural household until they were replaced by newer, more suitable dinner guests. "What happens to us now?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Margaret Patterson smiled with motherly warmth. "Now you're part of our family. You'll help us maintain the house, preserve the traditions, and welcome future guests when the time comes for new additions to our dinner table." I looked at Sarah, who was eating her spectral meal with obvious enjoyment. She caught my eye and smiled, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of my wife's true personality beneath the supernatural influence. "The food is wonderful," she said. "I've never tasted anything like it." But even as she spoke, I could see that she was changing. Her skin was becoming paler, more translucent. Her movements were taking on the formal, measured quality of someone from a different era. She was becoming a Victorian ghost, just like the Patterson family. Looking down at my own hands, I could see that the same transformation was affecting me. My flesh was becoming less solid, and my clothes were shifting to match the formal style worn by William Patterson. I was dying, or rather, I was transitioning from life to whatever existence the Patterson family had maintained for 70 years. The strange part was how peaceful it felt. The food was indeed delicious. The conversation was engaging, and the sense of belonging to a close-knit family was stronger than anything I'd experienced in life. If this was death, it was a comfortable, social kind of death that came with excellent dining and pleasant company. But as the evening wore on and my transformation continued, I began to understand the true nature of our situation. We weren't just dinner guests who'd been trapped by supernatural forces. We were replacements, new family members recruited to maintain the Patterson family's eternal dinner party while the original family members moved on to whatever afterlife awaited them. Margaret Patterson confirmed this during dessert, when she explained that their spiritual energy was finally diminishing after 7 decades of maintaining their ghostly existence. "We've been waiting for the right couple to take over stewardship of the house," she said as she served elaborate slices of cake that tasted like celebrations and nostalgia. "Young people who understand the importance of family traditions and proper hospitality." William nodded approvingly. "You and Sarah will make excellent hosts for future dinner parties. The house chooses its occupants carefully, and it chose you for good reasons." As the meal concluded and the Patterson family began to fade, becoming more translucent with each passing moment, I realized that Sarah and I were inheriting more than just a house. We were becoming the new ghost family, bound to this dining room and responsible for maintaining the supernatural dinner parties that kept the house's spiritual ecosystem in balance. The original Patterson family dissolved into mist and memory, finally able to move on to their eternal rest now that suitable replacements had been found. Sarah and I remained at the table, now the primary spirits haunting our own home. "How do you feel?" I asked Sarah as we sat alone in the dining room that had become our eternal domain. She considered the question thoughtfully. "Different, but not bad. Like we've become part of something larger than ourselves. This house needs caretakers, and now we're those caretakers. Over the following weeks, we learned the rules of our new existence. During daylight hours, we could move around the house normally, appearing and feeling mostly human. But as evening approached, especially during the dinner hours, we became more ghostly, more connected to the house's supernatural energy. We began preparing for our own dinner parties, learning to manifest the elaborate meals and formal place settings that would eventually attract new living occupants to the house. The process was instinctive, like remembering skills we'd always possessed but never had occasion to use. 6 months later, Jennifer Walsh brought another young couple to view the house, a nice pair of newlyweds who were amazed by the beautiful Victorian furnishings and the incredibly reasonable asking price. Sarah and I watched from the dining room as Jennifer explained about the previous owners who'd left everything behind due to a family emergency. We smiled at each other, remembering how convincing that story had seemed when we'd first heard it. The new couple was perfect for our purposes. Young, romantic, and clearly enchanted by the house's period atmosphere. They made an offer that same afternoon, and we knew that within a few weeks, we'd have new dinner guests to welcome into our supernatural family. Some people spend their whole lives looking for a sense of belonging, a place where they feel truly at home. Sarah and I found that place in death, in a Victorian dining room where family dinner is the most important meal of the day, every day, forever. The Patterson family had been excellent hosts during their 70 years of supernatural residency. We intended to uphold that tradition, to maintain the house's welcoming atmosphere and continue the dinner parties that made this place special. And if you're ever house hunting and find a beautiful Victorian home with period furnishings at a price that seems too good to be true, pay attention to the dining room. Notice whether the table is set for more people than are currently living there. Check whether the chairs look like they've been recently occupied, because some dinner invitations are more permanent than others, and some families are always looking for new members to join them around the table. The Patterson family waited 70 years to find suitable replacements. Sarah and I are more patient. We're prepared to wait as long as it takes to find the right couple to carry on the tradition. After all, good things come to those who wait, and the best family dinners are worth waiting for, even if they last for eternity. Mrs. Patterson was writing math problems on the chalkboard with her back to me, even though she'd been dead for 3 months, and when she turned around, half her face was caved in from the car accident, while the other half smiled at me like nothing had happened. The 27 children at their desks were all staring at me with hollow eye sockets, their school uniforms still smoldering from the fire that had killed them in 1978. And I realized that room 237 hadn't been empty all semester because they couldn't find a replacement teacher. It had been occupied the entire time. But let me back up to 4 months ago, when I was just Rebecca Martinez, 28-year-old substitute teacher desperately trying to land a permanent position at Riverside Elementary. I'd been working as a substitute for 3 years since finishing my teaching credential, bouncing between different schools and classrooms, never staying anywhere long enough to build real relationships with students or establish myself as anything more than a temporary solution to staffing problems. The job market for elementary teachers was brutal, hundreds of qualified candidates competing for every permanent opening, and most schools preferring to hire fresh graduates they could mold to their specific systems rather than experienced substitutes who might have developed habits from working at multiple locations. Riverside Elementary had been my most consistent placement over the past year. Built in 1952, it was a classic 2-story brick building that served about 400 students from kindergarten through 6th grade. The staff was welcoming, the administration was professional, and the students were generally well-behaved kids from middle-class families who valued education. Principal Williams had been hinting for months that a permanent position might open up soon. Budget approvals were pending for an additional 3rd-grade teacher, and my work as a substitute had apparently impressed both the administration and the teaching staff. "Keep doing what you're doing, Rebecca," Principal Williams had told me during my last evaluation. When the right opportunity comes along, you'll be our first choice." That opportunity seemed to arrive in late August when Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the 6th grade teacher in room 237, was killed in a car accident 3 weeks into the new school year. It was a tragedy that shook the entire school community. Mrs. Patterson had been teaching at Riverside for 15 years, was beloved by students and parents alike, and had been just 2 years away from retirement. The funeral was devastating. Hundreds of people attended, including dozens of former students who credited Mrs. Patterson with inspiring their love of learning. She'd been the kind of teacher who remembered every student's name, who stayed after school to provide extra help, who organized fundraisers for families in need, and who treated teaching as a calling rather than just a job. But life had to continue, and room 237 needed a teacher. "Rebecca," Principal Williams said when he called me the morning after the funeral, "I know this is a difficult situation for everyone, but we need someone to take over Mrs. Patterson's class. The district is posting the position officially, but the hiring process could take weeks, and these kids can't wait that long." I accepted immediately. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for, even though the circumstances were heartbreaking. Room 237 would be my classroom, at least temporarily, and if I could prove myself capable of managing a full-time teaching load, the temporary assignment might become permanent. My first day in room 237 was emotionally challenging for everyone involved. The students, 27 6th graders between 11 and 12 years old, were still processing the loss of their beloved teacher. Some were openly grieving. Others seemed angry about the disruption to their routine, and a few appeared to be in denial about Mrs. Patterson's death. "When is Mrs. Patterson coming back?" asked Emma Rodriguez, a quiet girl who'd been one of Mrs. Patterson's favorites. "She's not coming back, sweetheart," I explained gently. "Mrs. Patterson died in the car accident. I'm going to be your teacher now, and I'm going to do my best to take care of you the way she would have wanted." The classroom itself was a shrine to Mrs. Patterson's 15 years of dedication. The walls were covered with student artwork, motivational posters, and educational displays that she'd carefully curated over the years. Her desk was exactly as she'd left it, complete with family photos, a coffee mug that read "World's Best Teacher," and a grade book filled with her neat handwriting. I tried to maintain as much of Mrs. Patterson's routine and classroom environment as possible. The students needed stability and continuity during this difficult transition, and changing too much too quickly would only add to their stress. I used her lesson plans, followed her classroom management system, and even tried to adopt some of her teaching strategies that the students had grown accustomed to. But there were signs from the beginning that something unusual was happening in room 237. It started with small things. The chalkboard would sometimes show math problems or vocabulary words that I hadn't written. When I'd ask the students about it, they'd insist that Mrs. Patterson had written them, even though Mrs. Patterson had been dead for weeks. "She wrote those yesterday after you left," 10-year-old Michael Santos told me when I questioned him about a set of multiplication problems that had appeared overnight. "Michael, Mrs. Patterson isn't here anymore. Remember? We talked about this," but Michael just shook his head stubbornly. "She comes back after school to finish her work. I saw her through the window when my mom picked me up late yesterday." The other students nodded in agreement, and several of them shared similar stories about seeing Mrs. Patterson in the classroom after hours, working at her desk, organizing supplies, preparing lessons for the next day, always doing the kinds of tasks that dedicated teachers do when students aren't around to see them. I mentioned these incidents to Principal Williams during our weekly check-in meeting. "The students are still having trouble accepting that Mrs. Patterson is gone," I explained. "They keep insisting they see her in the classroom after school." Principal Williams nodded sympathetically. "Grief counseling is available for any student who needs it. Children process loss differently than adults. and sometimes they create coping mechanisms that help them deal with trauma. Imagining that Mrs. Patterson is still here might be their way of maintaining a connection to her. That explanation made sense from a psychological perspective, but it didn't account for the physical evidence I was beginning to discover. Lesson plans would appear on my desk written in Mrs. Patterson's distinctive handwriting. Educational materials would be organized in ways I didn't remember arranging them. The classroom would sometimes smell like the lavender perfume that Mrs. Patterson had worn, even though the building's custodial staff used industrial cleaning products that should have eliminated any lingering personal scents. Most unsettling of all, I began finding tests and homework assignments that had been graded in Mrs. Patterson's red ink, with comments and corrections in her handwriting. These weren't old papers that had been overlooked during the transition. They were current assignments that I'd given to the students, marked with grades and feedback that I hadn't provided. Mrs. Patterson graded our math tests, announced Sarah Chen during our morning meeting time. I looked at the stack of tests on my desk, which I'd collected the previous day but hadn't had time to grade yet. Every paper had been marked with a red pen, scored with Mrs. Patterson's familiar grading system, and included encouraging comments in her handwriting. "That's impossible, Sarah. Mrs. Patterson can't grade your tests anymore." But the evidence was right there in front of me. 27 math tests, all graded accurately and thoughtfully, with the kind of detailed feedback that Mrs. Patterson had been known for providing to her students. I took the tests to Principal Williams immediately. "This is very strange," he admitted as he examined the graded papers. "The handwriting does look like Eleanor's, and the grading style is consistent with her methods. But obviously, there has to be a logical explanation. What kind of logical explanation accounts for a dead teacher grading current assignments?" Principal Williams studied the papers more carefully, comparing them to samples of Mrs. Patterson's handwriting from previous years. Could another teacher have done this as a gesture of support? Maybe someone who worked closely with Eleanor and wanted to help you with the grading load? We checked with every teacher on staff. None of them had accessed room 237 after hours, and none of them admitted to grading the math tests. The custodial staff had keys to the room, but they insisted they hadn't seen anyone in the classroom during their evening cleaning rounds. That night, I decided to stay late and observe room 237 directly. If someone was entering the classroom after hours, I wanted to catch them in the act and solve this mystery once and for all. I remained in the school building until about 9 p.m., hiding in an empty classroom across the hall where I could watch room 237 through the window in the door. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. The room remained dark and empty, exactly as I'd left it after the students were dismissed. But around 10 p.m., I began to see changes. Light appeared under the door to room 237. Not the harsh fluorescent lighting of the school's electrical system, but a warmer, softer glow like sunlight filtering through windows. Then I heard sounds that shouldn't have been possible in an empty school building. Children's voices, quiet classroom chatter, the rustle of papers, the scratch of pencils on paper, and the familiar rhythm of a typical school day in progress. I crept closer to the window and peered into room 237. The classroom was full of students, not the 27 sixth graders I taught during the day, but a different group of children wearing clothes that looked decades out of date. The boys wore button-up shirts and neat trousers, while the girls were dressed in simple skirts and blouses that looked like they belonged in the 1970s. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Patterson, looking exactly as she had in life. No injuries from the car accident, no signs of death or decay, just the dedicated teacher I'd heard so much about, conducting a normal lesson with her characteristic enthusiasm and patience. "Now, who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals?" she asked, scanning the room for volunteers. Multiple hands shot up, and she called on a boy in the front row who answered confidently, 56. "Mrs. Patterson. Very good, Tommy. Now let's try a more challenging problem." I stood frozen in the hallway, watching a dead teacher conduct a class with students who looked like they'd stepped out of a historical photograph. The scene was impossible, but it was happening right in front of me with all the mundane normalcy of any other school day. Mrs. Patterson must have sensed my presence because she looked up from her lesson and made direct eye contact with me through the classroom window. She smiled and waved, the same friendly greeting she might have given to any colleague passing by her room during regular school hours. Then she walked to the door and opened it. "Rebecca," she said warmly. "How wonderful to see you. Would you like to observe my class? I think you might find our teaching methods interesting." I wanted to run, to flee the building and pretend I'd never seen this impossible scene. But my professional curiosity was stronger than my fear, and I found myself following Mrs. Patterson into room 237. The classroom felt different when I was inside it. Warmer, more welcoming, filled with the kind of positive energy that comes from dedicated teaching and engaged learning. The students looked up at me with polite interest, and several of them smiled and waved as if I were a welcome guest rather than an intruder in their supernatural classroom. "Students, I'd like you to meet Miss Martinez. She's the teacher who's been taking care of room 237 during regular school hours." The children chorused a polite, "Hello, Miss Martinez," in unison, their voices carrying the kind of respectful enthusiasm that teachers dream of inspiring in their students. "Mrs. Patterson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what is this? Who are these children?" Her expression became sad, and she gestured for me to join her at the back of the classroom where we could speak privately while her students continued working on their math problems. "These are my students from 1978, she explained quietly. "They died in the school fire that year, along with their regular teacher, Miss Henderson. I've been taking care of them ever since, making sure they don't miss out on their education." I stared at the children, who were working diligently on their assignments with the focus and enthusiasm of students who truly loved learning. They looked solid and real, but now I could see the subtle signs that marked them as something other than living children. Their clothes never wrinkled, their hair never became disheveled, and their eyes held a timeless quality that spoke of decades spent in the same classroom. "The fire was in 1978, I said, trying to process what Mrs. Patterson was telling me. "But you didn't start teaching here until 1985, she confirmed, 7 years after the fire. But when I took over room 237, I discovered that these children were still here, still waiting for someone to teach them. They'd been without proper instruction for all that time." She gestured toward her ghostly students with obvious affection. "I couldn't abandon them just because they were dead. They deserved the same quality education as any living child. So I stayed after school every day to make sure they didn't fall behind in their studies. For 15 years? For 15 years. And now that I've died as well, we can finally conduct proper full-day classes instead of just evening sessions." I looked around the classroom, understanding now why room 237 had felt so different since I'd started teaching there. It had never been empty. Mrs. Patterson had been continuing her lessons with her supernatural students, maintaining the same dedication to education that had defined her entire career. "What about my students?" I asked. "The living children I teach during the day?" Mrs. Patterson smiled. "They're still learning, aren't they? You've been doing an excellent job with them, but you've also been teaching them alongside my students, though you didn't realize it." She pointed to the desks where my 27 sixth graders sat during regular school hours. "My students occupy the same spaces during evening hours. They observe your teaching methods, learn from your lessons, and sometimes help with grading papers when they think you might appreciate the assistance. The graded tests, the organized materials, the lesson plans that appeared on my desk. It had all been the work of Mrs. Patterson and her ghostly students, trying to support my teaching efforts while continuing their own eternal education. "This is impossible," I whispered. "Ghosts aren't real. Dead people don't continue teaching school. Death doesn't end dedication, Rebecca. It just changes the schedule. Over the following weeks, I found myself staying late more and more often to observe Mrs. Patterson's evening classes. Her teaching methods were remarkable, combining traditional educational techniques with the kind of patience and creativity that only comes from decades of experience. Her students were equally impressive. Despite being dead for over 40 years, they were engaged, curious, and eager to learn. They asked thoughtful questions, helped each other with difficult concepts, and showed the kind of academic enthusiasm that every teacher hopes to inspire. Why don't they move on? I asked Mrs. Patterson one evening as we watched her students work on a science project about the solar system. Where would they go? This is their school, their classroom, their safe place. They died here, but they also lived here in the truest sense. Their happiest memories, their greatest achievements, their sense of purpose and belonging. It's all connected to this room. She paused in her grading to look at me directly. The same way this room has become connected to you. You found your calling here, haven't you? Teaching these children, making a difference in their lives? She was right. Despite the supernatural circumstances, Room 237 had become exactly what I'd been searching for during my years as a substitute teacher. A place where I belonged, where my teaching mattered, where I could build lasting relationships with students who valued education. But the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. During the day, I taught my living students with growing confidence and effectiveness. They were responding well to my methods. Their test scores were improving, and several parents had specifically requested that I be considered for the permanent position. At night, I observed Mrs. Patterson teaching her ghostly students, learning from her experience, and gradually being drawn into their supernatural classroom community. The two worlds were beginning to blend together in ways that should have been impossible. My living students started showing knowledge they shouldn't have possessed, answering questions about topics I hadn't covered yet, demonstrating skills that were beyond their grade level. When I asked them how they'd learned these things, they'd mention Mrs. Patterson or refer to lessons that had supposedly taken place after school. Mrs. Patterson taught us about fractions yesterday. Emma Rodriguez told me when I asked her to explain a particularly advanced math concept she'd demonstrated. Emma, we haven't started the fractions unit yet. That's not scheduled until next month. But Emma just smiled and showed me her notebook, which contained detailed notes about fractions written in Mrs. Patterson's handwriting. The boundary between the living and dead students was dissolving, and I was caught in the middle of a supernatural situation that was affecting the education of children on both sides of existence. Principal Williams noticed the changes in my teaching effectiveness during his routine classroom observations. "Your students seem remarkably advanced for this point in the school year," he commented after watching me conduct a literature discussion that would have been challenging for 8th graders. "Their comprehension levels and analytical thinking skills are well beyond what we typically see in 6th grade. They're very motivated learners," I said, which was technically true even if it didn't explain the supernatural tutoring they were receiving. "The district has been impressed with the reports I've been sending about room 237. There's serious consideration being given to offering you the permanent position. That should have been the best news of my teaching career. The permanent position I'd been working toward for 3 years. Recognition of my abilities, job security, and the chance to build a long-term career at Riverside Elementary. But accepting the permanent position would mean committing to room 237 indefinitely, and I was beginning to understand that room 237 came with responsibilities that extended far beyond normal teaching duties. Mrs. Patterson confirmed this during one of our evening conversations. "The children need consistency, Rebecca. Both the living and the dead. They need a teacher who understands that education doesn't end with the school bell, and that some students require instruction beyond normal classroom hours." "What are you asking me to do?" "What I did for 15 years. Teach during the day, teach during the evening, and make sure that every child in room 237 receives the quality education they deserve, regardless of their current state of existence. I spent several sleepless nights considering her request. Teaching Mrs. Patterson's ghostly students would mean dedicating my evenings to supernatural education for the rest of my career. It would mean accepting a reality where death didn't end the need for learning, and where my teaching responsibilities extended into realms that most educators never contemplated. But it would also mean becoming part of something larger than typical public education, a continuous cycle of learning and growth that transcended the normal limitations of human existence. My decision was made easier by the children themselves, both living and dead. They had formed connections that crossed the boundary between life and death, supporting each other's learning and creating a classroom community that was more inclusive and caring than anything I'd experienced in traditional educational settings. The living students had accepted the presence of their ghostly classmates with the adaptability that children show toward things adults find impossible to understand. They shared supplies, collaborated on projects, and treated their supernatural peers as naturally as they would any other classmates. Tommy helped me with my science report, Michael Santos told me, referring to one of Mrs. Patterson's ghostly students. He's really smart about planets and stuff. The dead students were equally supportive of their living classmates, offering assistance and encouragement that helped improve academic performance across the board. Test scores in room 237 were the highest in the school, and parent satisfaction surveys showed unprecedented levels of approval for the education their children were receiving. On the evening when I finally gave Mrs. Patterson my answer, room 237 was filled with both sets of students, working together on a collaborative history project that spanned multiple decades of local events. "I'll do it," I told her. "I'll teach both classes, day and evening, for as long as you need me to." Mrs. Patterson smiled with obvious relief and satisfaction. "Thank you, Rebecca. These children deserve the best possible education, and you're the best teacher they could hope for." Over the following months, I settled into my new routine. Regular school days with living students, evening sessions with ghostly students, and preparation time that extended far beyond normal teaching hours. It was demanding work, but also the most fulfilling career I could have imagined. The permanent position was officially offered to me in December, and I accepted it with the understanding that room 237 would be my professional home for the foreseeable future. Principal Williams and the school district were thrilled with the academic progress being made by my students, though they never suspected the supernatural tutoring that was contributing to those achievements. Mrs. Patterson gradually transitioned from active teaching to a mentoring role, sharing her decades of experience while allowing me to develop my own methods and relationships with both sets of students. It was the kind of professional development opportunity that most teachers never receive. Intensive one-on-one guidance from a master educator. "You're a natural teacher, Rebecca," she told me one evening as we watched our combined classes work together on reading comprehension exercises. "These children are lucky to have you." By spring, room 237 had become something unique in public education. A classroom where living and dead students learned together, where academic achievement transcended the normal limitations of mortality, and where dedicated teaching continued around the clock to serve the needs of every child. My living students were performing at levels that impressed everyone from parents to district administrators. They demonstrated critical thinking skills, collaborative abilities, and academic enthusiasm that set them apart from their peers in other classrooms. The ghostly students were equally successful, finally receiving the consistent, quality education that had been interrupted by their tragic deaths decades earlier. They were completing grade-appropriate work, developing their intellectual abilities, and maintaining the love of learning that Mrs. Patterson had nurtured in life and continued in death. The school year ended with recognition ceremonies for both groups of students. The living children received awards and certificates for their outstanding academic achievements, while the ghostly students celebrated their own academic milestones in evening ceremonies that honored their dedication to continued learning despite the challenges of their supernatural state. "Next year will be even better," Mrs. Patterson told me as we prepared room 237 for summer break. "You've established such a strong foundation with both groups of students. They trust you, respect you, and are excited about continuing their education with you." As I locked room 237 for the summer, I reflected on the unexpected direction my teaching career had taken. I'd started the year as a substitute teacher desperate for permanent employment. I was ending it as the only educator in the district who managed supernatural students alongside living ones, providing round-the-clock instruction to children whose educational needs extended far beyond normal classroom hours. The work was challenging, often overwhelming, and completely outside the scope of traditional teacher preparation programs. But it was also the most meaningful career I could have imagined. Every day brought opportunities to make a difference in the lives of children who valued education enough to continue learning even after death. Some teachers spend their entire careers searching for students who are truly dedicated to learning. I found 27 of them in a classroom that everyone else thought was empty, taught by a teacher who was so committed to education that death itself couldn't end her dedication to her profession. Mrs. Patterson had spent 15 years balancing regular teaching duties with supernatural educational responsibilities. Now it was my turn to carry on that tradition, to ensure that room 237 remained a place where every child could receive the quality education they deserved, regardless of their current state of existence. If you're ever considering a career in education, remember that the most rewarding teaching positions might not be the ones that appear in typical job postings. Sometimes the best students are the ones who've been waiting the longest for someone to care about their education. And sometimes the most dedicated teachers are the ones who've been working overtime for decades to make sure no child is left behind. Even the ones who died in 1978, but never stopped wanting to learn. The train was derailing in slow motion, tilting sideways as the cars behind me telescoped together with the screaming sound of metal tearing apart. But none of the other passengers seemed to notice because they'd been reliving this exact crash every morning for 67 years. I was pressed against the window watching the ground rush up to meet us when I realized this was the moment I either found a way off this ghost train or became another permanent passenger on the 647 to nowhere. But let me back up to 2 months ago when I was just another commuter named Kevin Walsh, 34-year-old marketing manager for a downtown advertising agency, riding the same train route every weekday morning for the past 5 years. The Metro North line from Millbrook Station into the city was my lifeline, my daily routine that structured everything from when I woke up to when I got home each evening. I lived in Millbrook because it offered the perfect balance of suburban, quiet, and reasonable commute time, 45 minutes door-to-door from my apartment to my office building, assuming the trains ran on schedule. The mortgage was manageable, the neighborhood was safe, and the train service was reliable enough that I could count on getting to work at roughly the same time every morning. My routine was precisely calibrated. Alarm at 6:15 a.m., shower and breakfast by 6:35, walk to the station by 6:40, catch the 6:47 train that arrived downtown at 7:32, walk to the office building, at my desk with coffee by 7:45. It was the kind of clockwork schedule that made suburban life functional for people who worked in the city. The 6:47 was a popular train, filled with the same group of commuters every morning. We formed an informal community of people who saw each other 5 days a week but rarely spoke beyond polite nods and occasional complaints about delays. There was the woman in the red coat who always sat in the third car, the businessman with the Wall Street Journal who occupied the same seat in car 2, the college student with the overstuffed backpack who stood near the doors, and dozens of other regulars who made the same journey at the same time every weekday. I'd been riding the 6:47 47 for so long that I could navigate the entire trip with my eyes closed. Board at Millbrook, find a seat in car 4, read the news on my phone for 45 minutes, exit at Grand Central, walk through the terminal, catch the subway to my office building. Simple, predictable, and perfectly suited to my preference for routine. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning in late September. I'd boarded the 6, 47 as usual, and settled into my preferred seat in car 4 when I noticed that the other passengers looked different somehow. Their clothes seemed slightly outdated, like they were wearing styles from several decades ago. The woman in the red coat was wearing a dress that looked distinctly 1950s, and the businessman was reading a newspaper that appeared yellowed and brittle with age. I assumed it was some kind of themed event or costume day that I hadn't heard about. Corporate team-building activities sometimes included retro dress codes, and maybe several companies had coordinated something for their employees. But when I tried to check the date on my phone, the screen showed nothing but static. Not the usual no signal message, but actual television-style static with faint sounds that might have been old radio broadcasts bleeding through the electronic interference. I looked around the train car more carefully and realized that none of the other passengers were using modern devices. No smartphones, no tablets, no earbuds or wireless headphones. They were reading physical newspapers, carrying leather briefcases, and wearing watches that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Excuse me," I said to the man sitting across from me. "What's today's date?" He looked up from his newspaper with a polite smile. "September 18th, 1956. Tuesday morning. Running right on schedule today. 1956. That was impossible. I stared at the man, who appeared completely normal except for his outdated clothing and the newspaper he was reading, which I could now see was indeed from 1956. The headlines were about Eisenhower and events that had happened decades before I was born. I pulled out my phone again, but it still showed nothing but static. When I checked my wallet, my driver's license and credit cards were blank, as if all the modern identifying information had been erased from my possession. The train continued its familiar route toward downtown, making all the usual stops, but the stations we passed looked different, older, less maintained, with architectural details that suggested they hadn't been updated in decades. The other passengers boarded and exited normally, chatting about their jobs and families and plans for the day, all in the casual conversation style of people living in the 1950s. When we reached Grand Central, I followed the other passengers off the train, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. But the terminal looked exactly as it should have, modern and bustling with contemporary activity. My phone immediately returned to normal function, showing the correct date and time, and when I checked my wallet, all my identification was back to normal. I spent the workday trying to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of stress-related hallucination. Long work hours, poor sleep habits, and too much caffeine had probably combined to create a vivid daydream that seemed more real than it actually was. By evening, I'd almost managed to dismiss the entire incident as a product of an overactive imagination. But the next morning, it happened again. The 6:47 train looked normal when it pulled into Millbrook Station. I boarded, found my usual seat, and settled in for the regular commute. But as soon as the train left the station, the other passengers began changing. Their clothes shifted to 1950 styles, their newspapers yellowed and became decades out of date, and their conversations took on the vocabulary and concerns of people living in a different era. This time, I was more observant. I listened to their conversations, trying to understand who these people were and what was happening to the train during our journey into the city. "Johnson's been talking about expanding the Hartford division," one businessman said to his companion. "Thinks there's real growth potential in the insurance market. My wife's been after me to buy one of those new television sets," replied his friend. Says all the neighbors have them now, but I'm not convinced it's worth the expense. They were discussing things that made sense for 1956, but with the casual familiarity of people living through those events rather than historical reenactors playing roles. These weren't costumes or performances. These people genuinely believed they were living in 1956. I tried engaging them in conversation, asking questions about current events and testing their knowledge of historical facts that hadn't happened yet in their timeline. "What do you think about the space program?" I asked the man sitting next to me. He looked confused. "Space program? Are you talking about science fiction? Like those Buck Rogers serials?" When I mentioned computers or cell phones or any technology that post-dated 1956, they responded with blank stares or polite confusion. But when I asked about events that were contemporary to their era, they answered with detailed knowledge and personal opinions. The train reached Grand Central on schedule, and once again, stepping off the platform returned everything to normal. The other passengers resumed their contemporary appearance. My phone worked properly, and the terminal looked exactly as it should have. I spent that evening researching the history of the Metro North Line, looking for any incidents or unusual events that might explain what I was experiencing. The search led me to a newspaper archive from September 18th, 1956, and an article that made my blood run cold. "Train derailment kills 34 commuters." The headline described a morning accident involving the 6:47 train from Millbrook to Grand Central. According to the article, a mechanical failure had caused the train to derail about halfway through its journey, killing 34 passengers and injuring dozens more. The accident had been one of the worst transportation disasters in the region's history. The article included a list of victims, and as I read through the names, I recognized several of them. The businessman who read the Wall Street Journal, the woman in the red coat, the college student with the backpack. They were all there, listed among the dead from September 18th, 1956. I was riding a ghost train, sharing my daily commute with people who had died in a crash 67 years ago. The next morning, I considered taking a different train or driving to work instead of risking another supernatural encounter. But morbid curiosity won out over common sense, and I found myself boarding the 6:47 once again. This time, I was prepared. I brought a notebook and pen to document everything I observed, and I made a point of speaking with as many passengers as possible to learn their stories. The woman in the red coat turned out to be Margaret Thompson, a secretary who worked for an insurance company downtown. She was 23 years old, engaged to be married, and excited about starting her new life with a man named Robert who worked as an accountant. "We're planning a June wedding," she told me as the train rolled through the countryside that looked increasingly like 1950s rural landscape. Nothing too elaborate, just family and close friends. Robert's parents have offered to host the reception at their house. The businessman was Harold Fletcher, a sales manager who had been commuting on the 6:47 for 8 years. He was married with 2 young children, lived in a house that he'd purchased with a GI Bill loan after the war, and was saving up to buy his family their first television set. "The kids keep asking about it," he said, showing me a photograph of 2 smiling children who couldn't have been more than 6 and 8 years old. "All their friends have television now. I suppose it's time we joined the modern age." Each passenger had a complete life story, detailed memories, and personal concerns that were entirely consistent with someone living in 1956. They weren't just ghostly echoes of people who had died. They were complete personalities, maintaining their relationships and continuing their daily routines as if the crash had never happened. "How long have you been taking this train?" I asked Margaret Thompson. 8 months now. Ever since I got the job downtown. It's such a convenient route, and the other passengers are always so friendly. We've become like a little community." That's when I realized what was happening. The passengers weren't just reliving the day they died. They were continuing to live. maintaining their relationships and routines, completely unaware that they had been killed in a train crash decades ago. The train was their entire world, a supernatural pocket of existence where they could continue their lives indefinitely, commuting to jobs they would never reach and returning to homes they would never see again. But as I spent more mornings with them, I began to understand that my presence was disrupting their eternal routine. They started asking questions about my modern clothes, my strange vocabulary, and my knowledge of events that hadn't happened yet in their timeline. "You seem different from the other regular passengers," Margaret observed during my 5th trip on the ghost train. "Are you new to the area?" "Something like that," I said, not wanting to explain that I was from 67 years in their future. But my evasive answers were making them suspicious, and I could see them exchanging glances and whispered conversations about the strange passenger who didn't quite fit into their 1950s world. The situation came to a crisis the following week when Harold Fletcher approached me directly. "We've been talking," he said, gesturing toward the other regular passengers, "and we think you might be lost. You don't seem to know where you're going or why you're here." "I'm just commuting to work, same as everyone else. But your work clothes are strange. Your speech patterns are unusual. And you keep asking questions about things that don't make sense. Margaret thinks you might be suffering from some kind of confusion or memory loss." The other passengers nodded in agreement, their faces showing genuine concern for my well-being. They had collectively decided that I was a lost soul who needed their help, and they were determined to take care of me the way any close community would look after a member in distress. "We want to help you remember who you are," Margaret said gently. "Sometimes, after traumatic experiences, people can become disoriented about time and place. But you're safe here with us. We'll help you figure out where you belong." That's when I realized the true horror of my situation. The ghost passengers weren't just unaware of their own deaths. They were actively trying to integrate me into their supernatural community to help me become a permanent member of their eternal commute. I began avoiding the 6:47 train, taking earlier or later trains to work instead of risking further contact with the ghost passengers. But the schedule change was disrupting my carefully calibrated routine, making me late for meetings and throwing off my entire daily rhythm. After 2 weeks of irregular commuting, I decided to take the 6:47 one final time to say goodbye to the passengers who had tried so hard to help me, even though they didn't understand my true situation. It was a decision I immediately regretted. The moment I boarded the train, Margaret Thompson rushed to greet me with obvious relief and excitement. "Kevin, we've been so worried about you. You disappeared for weeks without any explanation. Are you feeling better? Have you remembered where you live and where you're supposed to be going?" The other passengers gathered around me with similar expressions of concern and welcome. They had missed me during my absence, and they were genuinely happy to see me return to what they considered our shared community. "We saved your seat," Harold Fletcher said, guiding me to the spot in car 4 where I usually sat. "And Margaret brought extra coffee this morning in case you came back." Their kindness was overwhelming, but it was also terrifying. They had accepted me as a permanent member of their ghostly community, and they expected me to remain with them indefinitely. As the train began its journey toward downtown, I noticed that the scenery outside the windows was becoming less stable. Instead of the consistent 1950s landscape I'd observed before, the view was shifting between different time periods, sometimes showing modern highways and shopping centers, other times revealing countryside that looked like it hadn't been developed yet. "The route seems different today," I commented to Harold. He looked out the window with a puzzled expression. "Does it? Everything looks normal to me. Same view we see every morning." But Margaret was studying the passing landscape with growing confusion. "Something does seem unusual. The Miller farm should be coming up on the right, but I don't see the farmhouse." Other passengers began to notice the inconsistencies as well. pointing out landmarks that were missing or buildings that looked wrong for their expected time period. The comfortable routine of their eternal commute was being disrupted by my presence, and they were beginning to question the reality they'd accepted for 67 years. "Kevin," Margaret said, turning to me with a troubled expression, "what year do you think it is?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could continue lying, try to maintain the illusion that I belonged in their 1956 world, or I could tell them the truth about their situation and risk destroying the peaceful existence they'd maintained since their deaths. "It's 2023, I said quietly. "You died in a train crash on September 18th, 1956, all of you. This train derailed and killed 34 passengers. The reaction was immediate and devastating." Margaret's face went white with shock. Harold dropped his newspaper, and other passengers throughout the car began crying out in confusion and distress. "That's not possible," Margaret whispered. "We're here. We're alive. We're going to work just like we do every morning." But even as she spoke, the train car around us was beginning to change. The neat, well-maintained interior was showing signs of age and damage. Seats were becoming torn and stained. Windows were cracking, and the floor was littered with debris that looked like it had been there for decades. "Look around," I said gently. "Really look at where you are." For the first time since their deaths, the ghost passengers were seeing their situation clearly. The train car was a wreck, filled with the evidence of the crash that had killed them. Their bodies were scattered throughout the car, some still in their seats, others thrown against walls and windows by the force of the derailment. But they were also still there as spirits, maintaining their routines and relationships even after death, continuing to ride a train that would never reach its destination. "We're dead," Harold said, staring at his own body slumped in the seat across from where his spirit was standing. "We've been dead for 67 years. The train began to shake and lurch as the supernatural forces that had kept it running started to break down. My revelation had shattered the collective delusion that had sustained their ghostly existence, and now the reality of the crash was reasserting itself. "What happens to us now?" Margaret asked, looking around at the other passengers who were beginning to fade and flicker like images on a failing television screen. "I don't know," I admitted, "but maybe it's time to find out." The train was definitely derailing now, tilting sideways as it had 67 years ago, but this time the passengers were aware of what was happening. Instead of continuing their routine conversations about work and family, they were facing the reality of their deaths and the supernatural existence they'd maintained since the crash. Some of them seemed relieved to finally understand their situation. Others were terrified of what might come next. But all of them were looking at me as if I held the answers to questions they'd never been able to ask. "Will we see our families again?" Harold asked. "My wife, my children, they must have lived their whole lives without me." "I think you'll find out soon," I said, as the train continued its final crash sequence. But I wasn't going to be there to see what happened to them. I was still alive, still trapped in a supernatural situation that was rapidly becoming dangerous. As the ghost passengers began to accept their deaths and move on to whatever afterlife awaited them, I needed to find a way back to the world of the living. The train car was dissolving around us, becoming less solid as the spiritual energy that had maintained it for decades was finally dissipating. Through the fading walls, I could see the actual crash site, a section of track where twisted metal and overgrown weeds marked the spot where 34 people had died on a Tuesday morning in 1956. "Kevin," Margaret called to me as her figure became increasingly translucent. "Thank you for helping us understand. We couldn't move on until someone told us the truth about what happened." She and the other passengers were fading away, finally able to leave the train that had become their prison and their home. But I was still there, still solid, still trapped in a supernatural event that was collapsing around me. That's when I realized what I had to do. I wasn't a passenger on this ghost train. I was a visitor who had accidentally become caught up in their supernatural routine. If I could make it to the door and get off the train before it completely disappeared, I might be able to return to my own time and my own reality. I fought my way through the dissolving train car, past the fading figures of passengers who were finally at peace, toward the exit that might lead me back to the world of the living. The train was shaking itself apart around me, metal screaming and glass shattering as 67 years of suppressed crash damage finally manifested. I reached the door just as the last of the ghost passengers disappeared and the train car collapsed into the wreckage it had always been. Stepping out onto the platform at Millbrook Station, I found myself back in 2023, holding a normal train ticket, surrounded by living commuters who were waiting for their regular morning trains. My phone showed the correct date and time. My wallet contained all my proper identification, and according to the station display board, the 6:47 train was running 15 minutes late due to mechanical difficulties. When the 6:47 finally arrived, it was a perfectly normal modern train, filled with contemporary passengers wearing current fashions and using smartphones. No one was reading yellowed newspapers or discussing Eisenhower's policies. The woman in the red coat was gone. Harold Fletcher was nowhere to be seen, and Margaret Thompson was no longer saving seats for missing friends. I rode to Grand Central in a train car full of living people, and for the first time in weeks, my commute felt completely ordinary. But I never took the 6:47 again. The experience had shown me something about the nature of routine and how easily we can become trapped by our own schedules and expectations. The ghost passengers had been so committed to their daily commute that they'd continued riding the same train for 67 years after it crashed, unable to break free from a routine that had become their entire existence. I started varying my departure times, taking different trains, sometimes even driving to work instead of riding the Metro North Line. The irregular schedule was less convenient, but it gave me a sense of freedom that I'd never appreciated when I was locked into the same routine every day. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Margaret Thompson, Harold Fletcher, and the other passengers after they finally accepted their deaths and moved on from the ghost train. Did they find peace? Were they reunited with family members who had lived full lives and died naturally decades later? I hope they found whatever they were looking for beyond the endless commute that had defined their supernatural existence. The 6:47 train still runs every weekday morning, carrying living passengers from Millbrook to Grand Central. The route is efficient, the schedule is reliable, and for most commuters, it's just another way to get to work. But if you ever find yourself on a train where the other passengers seem to be dressed in outdated clothing, where the newspapers look yellowed with age, and where your phone shows nothing but static, pay attention to the date. Some routines are harder to break than death itself, and some commutes never really end, even after the train has reached its final destination. The ghost passengers of the 6:47 spent 67 years riding a train to nowhere, trapped by their inability to accept that their journey was over. Don't let your own routines become so rigid that you can't step off the train when it's time to get on with the rest of your life. Sweet dreams. And remember that sometimes the most important thing about any journey is knowing when you've arrived at your destination, even if it's not the one you originally planned to reach. I was watching my own funeral through the living room window, seeing my family lower a casket into the ground while I stood behind them in the same clothes I'd been wearing for the past 40 years without realizing I was dead. The photo album in my hands showed me at every family gathering since 1983, always in the background, always watching, and now the memories were flooding back about the night I died in this house and why I'd been haunting my own bloodline ever since. But let me back up to 3 weeks ago when I was just another grieving grandson named Michael Sterling, 29 years old, cleaning out my grandmother's house after her funeral. Rose Sterling had lived in the same Victorian home for 63 years, raising 5 children, hosting countless family gatherings, and accumulating the kind of possessions that only someone with deep roots and no plans to move ever manages to collect. The house on Maple Street had been the center of our family's universe for as long as I could remember. Every holiday, birthday, and important milestone had been celebrated in Rose's dining room, with her famous pot roast and homemade apple pie served on china that had been passed down through 3 generations. She was the family historian, the keeper of traditions, and the person who made sure everyone stayed connected despite the natural drift that tends to scatter relatives across different cities and states. Rose had died peacefully in her sleep at age 87, surrounded by family photos and mementos from a life well lived. The funeral had been exactly what she would have wanted: simple, dignified, and attended by 4 generations of sterling family members who shared stories about her kindness, her stubborn streak, and her incredible ability to remember every birthday, anniversary, and achievement of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. As the youngest grandson and the only family member who lived locally, I'd volunteered to handle the estate cleanup. Rose had left the house to be sold with proceeds divided among her children, but someone needed to sort through 60 years of accumulated possessions and decide what should be kept, donated, or discarded. The task was emotionally overwhelming. Every room contained layers of family history, furniture that had been purchased when Rose's children were young, artwork created by grandchildren during summer visits, closets full of clothes that told the story of changing fashions and family celebrations. It was like archaeologically excavating decades of family life, but it was the photographs that really got to me. Rose had been obsessive about documenting family events. She owned dozens of photo albums, organized chronologically and meticulously labeled with dates, locations, and the names of everyone who appeared in each picture. Christmas mornings, Easter dinners, graduation ceremonies, wedding receptions, baby christenings, birthday parties, IRF. She had captured every significant moment in the Sterling family's shared history. I spent an entire afternoon going through the albums, reliving memories from my own childhood and discovering photos from before I was born that showed my parents, aunts, and uncles as young people. It was fascinating to see how everyone had changed over the decades, how hairstyles and clothing had evolved, how the family had grown from Rose's original 5 children to a sprawling network of spouses, children, and grandchildren. That's when I started noticing the figure in the background. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. In a 1983 Christmas photo, there was someone standing behind the couch where my young parents were opening presents. The figure was slightly out of focus, but it appeared to be a man in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a dark sweater and jeans. I didn't recognize him as any family member, but family gatherings often included friends, neighbors, or distant relatives who might not have been clearly identified in Rose's labeling system. I assumed he was someone's boyfriend or a family friend who had been invited to join the celebration, but then I found him in more photos. A 1985 Easter dinner picture showed him standing near the kitchen doorway while everyone else was seated around the dining room table. A 1987 graduation party photo captured him in the backyard, partially hidden behind a tree, watching the festivities from a distance. In every photo, he was dressed in the same dark sweater and jeans, maintaining the same approximate age despite the passage of years. And in every photo, he was positioned away from the main action, like someone who was observing the family gatherings rather than participating in them. By the time I'd gone through a decade of photos, I'd found him in at least 20 pictures, always in the background, always watching, always wearing the same clothes and appearing to be the same age. I started paying closer attention to the photos from the 1990s, looking specifically for the mysterious figure. He was there in my 8th birthday party pictures, standing behind the group of children gathered around the cake. He appeared in my cousin Sarah's high school graduation photos, barely visible through a window in the background. He was present at my Uncle Tom's wedding reception, standing at the edge of the dance floor while couples swayed to music I could almost remember hearing. The most unsettling discovery was a series of photos from my own high school graduation in 2012. My grandmother had taken dozens of pictures that day, documenting everything from the ceremony itself to the family dinner afterward. In at least half of those photos, the figure was visible somewhere in the frame, always positioned where he could observe the Sterling family's celebration of my academic achievement. But here's what made my skin crawl. I remembered that graduation day clearly, and I had no memory of seeing this person at any point during the festivities. If he'd been present at my graduation dinner, if he'd been standing in Rose's backyard while we took family photos, I should have noticed him. I should have wondered who he was and why he was watching our private family gathering. I brought the photo albums to my parents' house that evening, hoping they could identify the mysterious figure who'd apparently been attending Sterling family events for decades. "Mom, Dad, do you recognize this person?" I asked, showing them several photos where the figure was clearly visible. My mother, Janet Sterling, put on her reading glasses and studied the pictures carefully. "I'm not sure. He looks familiar, but I can't place him. Maybe he was a neighbor or someone's friend." My father, Robert Sterling, examined the photos with a puzzled expression. "That's strange. I don't remember seeing him at any of these events, but he's clearly there in the pictures. You'd think I'd remember a stranger showing up to family gatherings." We called Rose's other children, my aunts and uncles, to see if any of them could identify the mysterious family observer. Each of them had the same reaction. The figure looked vaguely familiar, but no one could specifically remember him being present at the events where he'd been photographed. "It's like he was there but invisible," my Aunt Linda said during our phone conversation. "I can see him in the photos, but I have no memory of him actually being at those parties." That night, I returned to Rose's house to continue going through her possessions, but I couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious figure in the family photos. Who was he? Why had he been present at Sterling family gatherings for 30 years? And why didn't anyone remember seeing him despite clear photographic evidence of his presence? I decided to search the house for any additional clues about his identity. Rose had kept meticulous records of family history, including genealogy charts, old letters, and documentation about relatives going back several generations. If this person was connected to the Sterling family in some way, there might be evidence of that connection somewhere in her files. I started with her desk in the home office, going through drawers full of family documents and correspondence. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates, immigration papers from ancestors who had come to America in the early 1900s. Rose had preserved everything that might be relevant to the family's history. In the bottom drawer, I found a folder labeled Michael, 1983 in Rose's careful handwriting. Michael was my name, but I hadn't been born until 1995. Curious about what documents might be in a folder with my name dated to a year before my birth, I opened it to find newspaper clippings, police reports, and correspondence that made my hands shake as I read. The newspaper headline was from October 15th, 1983. Local man dies in house fire. The article described a fire at 847 Maple Street, Rose's address, that had killed a 28-year-old man named Michael Sterling. According to the report, the victim had been Rose Sterling's nephew, the son of her deceased brother William, who had been staying in the house temporarily while looking for permanent housing. The fire had started in the basement, apparently caused by faulty electrical wiring. Michael Sterling had died of smoke inhalation in his sleep and was found in the upstairs bedroom that Rose later converted into her sewing room. The fire had been contained to the basement and first floor, with most of the house remaining habitable after repairs. But here's the part that made my blood run cold. The police report included a photograph of the victim taken from his driver's license. It showed a man in his late 20s with dark hair and a serious expression, wearing what looked like a dark sweater. It was the same face I'd been seeing in 40 years of family photos. The man who'd been observing Sterling family gatherings since 1983 wasn't a mysterious stranger or a forgotten family friend. It was Michael Sterling, Rose's nephew, who had died in a house fire 40 years ago and had apparently been attending family events ever since, even though no one remembered seeing him. I was looking at evidence of a ghost who had been haunting his own family for 4 decades, present at every important gathering but invisible to the living relatives he'd been watching over. But that raised an even more disturbing question. If the ghost was Michael Sterling, Rose's nephew who had died in 1983, then who was I? I'd been named Michael Sterling after my great-uncle, the son of Rose's brother William. According to my birth certificate, I was Michael Sterling Jr., named in honor of the family member who had died 12 years before I was born. Except according to the documents in Rose's folder, Michael Sterling hadn't died in 1983. The newspaper reports were wrong, or the police had made a mistake, or the whole story was somehow fabricated. I spent the next hour going through every document in the folder, trying to make sense of contradictory information about Michael Sterling's death and my own existence. Birth certificates, death certificates, insurance claims, and family correspondence that painted a confusing picture of events that had supposedly happened decades before my birth. Then I found Rose's journal. She had kept a daily diary for most of her adult life, recording everything from weather observations to family news to her thoughts about current events. The entries from October 1983 told a different story than the official documents. October 14th, 1983. Michael seems troubled about something. He's been staying up late, pacing around the house, talking to himself. I'm worried about his state of mind since he lost his job. Maybe I should suggest he see a doctor about his anxiety. October 15th, 1983. Found Michael this morning. He'd hanged himself in the basement sometime during the night. Called the police, but there was nothing to be done. I can't bear to tell the family how he really died. Better to say it was an accident. October 16th, 1983. Arranged with Officer Thompson to report the death as accidental. The suicide would devastate William's memory of his son. A house fire seems more merciful than the truth. October 20th, 1983. Michael's funeral was small but dignified. I keep expecting to see him around the house, like he's still living in that upstairs bedroom. William would be heartbroken if he knew his son had taken his own life. The journal entries continued for weeks, documenting Rose's grief over her nephew's suicide and her decision to cover up the real circumstances of his death to protect the family from additional trauma. But the entries also described something else. Rose's growing awareness that Michael's spirit hadn't left the house. November 3rd, 1983. I swear I saw Michael in the kitchen this morning, making coffee like he used to do. When I looked directly at him, he wasn't there, but I could still smell the coffee brewing. November 18th, 1983. Michael was at the dinner table during Janet's birthday party. I could see him sitting in his usual chair, smiling and watching everyone enjoy the celebration. None of the others seemed to notice him. December 25th, 1983. Michael joined us for Christmas morning. He looked so peaceful, like he's finally found some happiness. I think he's staying close to watch over the family. Rose's journal documented 40 years of Michael Sterling's ghostly presence at family events. She had known all along that her nephew's spirit was attending gatherings, observing birthdays and holidays and graduations, maintaining his connection to the Sterling family despite his death, and she had never told anyone else about it. But as I read through decades of journal entries, I began to understand that Rose's awareness of Michael's ghost had gradually faded. The early entries showed clear recognition of his supernatural presence, but later entries mentioned him less frequently, as if she was losing the ability to see him even though he continued to appear in photographs. The last mention of Michael was from 2019, just a few years before Rose's death, July 4th, 2019. Sometimes I feel like someone familiar is watching me during family gatherings, a presence that makes me feel safe and loved, like I'm being protected by someone who cares deeply about our family. I can't quite remember who it might be, but the feeling is comforting. By the end of her life, Rose had forgotten about her nephew's suicide and his ghostly presence at family events. She had lived with his supernatural companionship for so long that it had become a natural part of her environment, no more remarkable than the familiar furniture or the photographs on her mantle. But I was still struggling with the central question. If Michael Sterling had died in 1983, and if his ghost had been attending family gatherings ever since, then what was my relationship to him? I looked at my driver's license, my birth certificate, my social security card. All of them confirmed that I was Michael Sterling Jr., born in 1995, the great-nephew of Rose Sterling. But the documents in Rose's folder suggested that the original Michael Sterling had died by suicide 12 years before I was born. That's when I started to remember things that didn't make sense. Memories of living in Rose's house as a child, playing in rooms that my parents had never mentioned visiting. Recollections of conversations with Rose about family history that had supposedly happened when I was too young to understand or remember such discussions. Knowledge of family events and relationships that I shouldn't have possessed based on my official age and birth date. I remembered being present at family gatherings that had taken place before I was born, standing in the background and watching relatives celebrate milestones in my supposed absence. I remembered observing my own parents as young adults, before they were married, before they had planned to have children. The memories were flooding back now, 40 years of ghostly existence that I had somehow forgotten or suppressed. I was Michael Sterling, Rose's nephew, who had died by suicide in 1983. I had been attending family gatherings as a spirit ever since, watching over the Sterling family and maintaining my connection to the people I loved. But at some point, I had convinced myself that I was still alive, that I was a different Michael Sterling, a great nephew rather than a nephew, born 12 years after my actual death. I had been living as a ghost for 40 years, but I had created an elaborate fiction about being alive to avoid confronting the reality of my suicide and the supernatural existence I had maintained since 1983, standing in Rose's house, surrounded by evidence of my own death and decades of ghostly presence at family events. I finally understood what had happened. The grief and trauma of my suicide had been so devastating that I had blocked out the memory of my death and convinced myself that I was still among the living, but the photographs didn't lie. Every family gathering since 1983 had included my spirit, watching from the background, maintaining my connection to the Sterling family despite my physical death. Rose had known the truth for a while, but even she had eventually forgotten about my supernatural presence as the years passed and my ghostly existence became a normal part of her daily life. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the backyard where Rose had been buried 3 weeks ago. The funeral had been real, attended by 4 generations of Sterling family members who genuinely mourned the loss of their family matriarch. But I hadn't been a living grandson attending his grandmother's funeral. I had been a ghost saying goodbye to the woman who had protected my memory and kept my secret for 40 years. I could see my family gathered around Rose's grave, lowering her casket into the ground while I stood behind them, invisible to their eyes but present in their hearts. My parents, my aunts and uncles, my cousins, all of them continuing their lives while I maintained my supernatural vigil over their shared history. The photo album in my hands contained the evidence of my 40-year haunting, documenting every family celebration I had attended as a spirit who refused to accept his own death. But now I remembered everything. The depression that had consumed me in 1983, the financial problems that had driven me to despair, the night I had decided that my family would be better off without me. I remembered the basement of Rose's house, the rope I had found in her storage room, the final moments before I had taken my own life, and I remembered the decades that followed, my growing awareness that death hadn't ended my connection to the Sterling family, my decision to remain close to the people I loved, and my gradual acceptance of a ghostly existence that allowed me to participate in family gatherings without the burden of my own mortality. But I had also remembered something else. My family's grief over my death, their struggle to understand why I had chosen suicide, and Rose's decision to protect them from that additional trauma by fabricating a story about an accidental house fire. For 40 years, I had been watching over a family that mourned my loss but never fully understood the circumstances of my death. They had named their children after me, told stories about my life, and kept my memory alive despite the pain of losing me so young. Looking at the family photos that documented my supernatural presence at decades of gatherings, I realized that my ghostly existence hadn't been about refusing to accept death. It had been about maintaining my connection to the people who had loved me, even after I had made the devastating decision to end my own life. I had been the family guardian, the invisible presence who watched over Sterling celebrations and ensured that the love we shared continued beyond the boundaries of life and death. But Rose was gone now, buried beside her husband in the cemetery where 3 generations of Sterling family members had been laid to rest. The woman who had understood my ghostly presence and protected my memory was no longer there to maintain the connection between my supernatural existence and the world of the living. It was time to let go. I set the photo albums on Rose's dining room table, arranging them so that whoever cleaned out the house next would find the complete visual history of the Sterling family. 4 decades of celebrations, milestones, and gatherings, all documented with Rose's meticulous care and attention to detail, including dozens of photos that showed a ghostly figure in the background, watching over his family with love that transcended death itself. I walked to the basement where I had died 40 years ago, to the spot where Rose had found me on that October morning when my depression had finally overwhelmed my will to live. The electrical work had long since been repaired, but I could still feel the echoes of that terrible night when I had made the decision that had defined the rest of my supernatural existence. "I'm sorry," I said to the empty house, apologizing to Rose for the secret she had carried, to my family for the pain my death had caused, and to myself for the 40 years I had spent unable to move on from the trauma of my suicide. But I wasn't sorry for staying close to my family, for watching over their celebrations, for maintaining my love for them despite the boundary between life and death. The Sterling family had been blessed with a guardian spirit who loved them enough to spend 4 decades attending their gatherings, documenting their history, and ensuring that their shared bonds remained strong across generations. As I finally prepared to release my hold on the physical world and move on to whatever afterlife awaited me, I looked one last time at the photos that proved my ghostly existence. 40 years of family history, with me always in the background, always watching, always loving the people who had given my life meaning. Some families have guardian angels who watch over them from a distance. The Sterling family had something rarer, a guardian spirit who attended every birthday party, graduation ceremony, and holiday celebration, maintaining his connection to the people he loved despite the tragedy of his own death. Rose had kept my secret for decades, allowing my family to remember me as someone who had died accidentally rather than by choice. But she had also allowed my spirit to remain close, to continue participating in family gatherings as an invisible presence who brought comfort and protection to the people who mattered most. Now it was time to trust that my family would be okay without their ghostly guardian. that the love we had shared would continue even after I finally moved on to join Rose and the other sterling ancestors who were waiting for me in whatever realm existed beyond the living world. If you ever find yourself going through a deceased relative's photo albums and notice the same person appearing in the background of family gatherings spanning multiple decades, pay attention to their story. Sometimes the people we love find ways to stay close even after death, watching over their families with dedication that transcends the normal boundaries of existence. And if that person happens to be wearing the same clothes in every photo, never aging despite the passage of years, always positioned where they can observe rather than participate, consider the possibility that love doesn't end with death. Sometimes it just changes form, becoming a guardian presence that protects and watches over the people who made life worth living. The Sterling family photos will always show a figure in the background of their celebrations. Future generations might wonder who he was and why he appears in so many family gatherings. But those of us who understand the true nature of love know that some bonds are strong enough to survive death itself, and some family members never really leave, even after they've been laid to rest. Sweet dreams, and remember to look carefully at your own family photos. You might be surprised by who's been watching over your celebrations all along.